Hello, this is Tikva from Homeopathy for Humanity, and I just want to touch on a few words that Boenninghousen has given us in his lovely book, The Lesser Writings, which is taken from various journals. He says the older homeopaths who have grown gray in practice, whose number indeed is much diminished, and whose voices are therefore but rarely heard, deem it a sort of retrogression when many of their younger colleagues bluntly reject dynamizations and potentizing, and again prescribe the low dilutions which were used in the first infancy of homeopathy by their author and his first pupils. Then he goes on to say that much progress as chemistry has made, especially in the last decennia, the last 100 years, all of which is to be recognized, it can only be considered as a baseless assumption if it asserts that substances having the same chemical relation to others must also exercise the same dynamic action on the living organism. Here we're going into dynamism again, just like we did in the aphorisms that we did recently. This indisputable, purely dynamic property of medical substances more sublimated and spiritual than that of the imponderables, in virtue of which that they either cause or remove discordances in the living organism, lies just outside the limits of chemistry as it lies outside the limits of botany, and it forms a basis of science by itself, which rests purely alone on the provings and experience on the living body, never on the dead body. For we must never forget in medical science, as it is nevertheless frequently done, people are always forgetting, he's saying, that the spiritual, invisible force, which we call the vital force, keeps substances combined together within the organism subject to its sway, which according to the laws of chemistry can never in the world remain in combination, while others remain within it side by side uncombined, which according to the same laws ought necessarily to combine. These laws of chemistry only enter on their dominion when life has departed and the body is given over to decomposition. These laws, therefore, and the laws of organic vitality are not only totally different and distinct from one another, but they also present to the observant investigator, both in the animal and in the vegetable kingdom, many phenomena which show actual contrarieties of the two. So this is very interesting. Schlosser came upon the information of he did the experiments taking dead bodies and cremating them and seeing what the chemical constituents were. And he said he looked to homeopathy for this information of turning it into a potentized product, but not the potentized product in a high potentization. A lot of tissue salts are done in a 6x, and that's the most common potency, at least in the Western hemisphere and the Western world in general, like, Europe. So Boenninghousen is saying that, as he grows old, he sees people going backwards using the decimal scale. We know where that comes from. That comes from Herring and Herring School in America. And then we have the biochemicals, the tissue salts. And he says that none of these things are the same thing as the dynamic vitality that influences the vital force, and that these things are very separate things. So the chemical constituents of what's inside a living being are not necessarily the only thing that's used by the living being in order to keep itself whole and performing properly, and that the dynamic properties need to be applied in order to cure disease. So Boenninghousen is just full of lots of very interesting little bits and pieces of information. So remember, as a Hahnemannian, we want to use dynamic potencies and not what they're calling today material homeopathy, because that sits outside of the dynamic range of homeopathy. That would be a slightly separate science, just as how tissue salts are not homeopathy, but they are used therapeutically. So this is just a little food for thought.